Hello, my name is Tej van Pettinger from Economics Help, and today we're going to look at the pros and cons of capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system characterized by free markets. There is the private ownership of land and capital, and then minimal government intervention, allowing individuals and firms to own property and run their own business. And there are some economists who are quite enthusiastic about this basic capitalist model. Milton Friedman, Hayek, Adam Smith to some extent. And the argument is that capitalism is the most efficient economic system because individuals tend to be motivated by self-interest. So in the capitalist model, you have the freedom to work as hard as you can and you get the rewards from it. There is an incentive for entrepreneurs to set up business because they know there are potentially high profits and a great benefit. And if everybody follows their own self-interest, this can paradoxically lead to an efficient allocation of resources because firms will want to respond to consumer preferences, bringing new products and find more efficient ways of doing it. And if you look at the past, say, 100, 200 years of world history, you see how capitalism has enabled a huge growth in the consumption of goods and services. We have unparalleled living standards, and this is by and large driven by the capitalist model. And also some supporters would say how capitalism has enabled greater life expectancy and better standards of living. Also related to the economic efficiency argument, an economist like Milton Friedman makes a political point that if you have economic freedom, this tends to lead to political freedom. At least that was Milton Friedman's perspective. And he was looking very much at he said that in the 1960s and the comparison between, say, the Soviet Union, a communist state, where the government controlled the economy and also controlled people's lives, whereas in the West, more capitalist-based economies and to a large degree greater individual liberty. And even going back to the father of economics, Adam Smith, he wrote about the benefits of free markets in the sense of he observed that if people follow their self-interest, this can lead, in some cases, to the greater good. So this is a rosy picture of capitalism, that people pursuing their self-interest leads to the greater good. But even a more mainstream economist like John Maynard Keynes was rather skeptical. He once said something like, capitalism is the outstanding belief that the wickedest of men will do the wickedest of acts for the greater good. And what he meant by that quote is that when people follow their self-interest, it often doesn't lead to an improvement in the greater good. And perhaps the most obvious example of that at the moment is the environmental pressures that come from capitalism and rapid economic growth. Because in the capitalist model, there is a primacy placed on ownership of capital. But who owns the land? Who owns the future? So the capitalist system has led to great growth in output, which has improved living standards. But it's had all these external costs on destruction of the environment, rising pollution, rising global warming, which threaten the very existence of life here on Earth as we know it. So this is a huge hole in the capitalist model. It's okay if there are no externalities, but of course in the real world there are many. Secondly, when you place the greatest emphasis on the ownership of private capital, this can lead to very great inequality. So for example, somebody may inherit their parents' wealth, and because of that they're in a very advantageous position in terms of better education, access to wealth, and their life is very different to somebody who has inherits nothing. Also, Adam Smith, although he's held up as a father of free market economics, he himself was very aware of the limitations of capitalism. One example he used was monopolies, because Adam Smith observed how capitalists, owners of business, were very keen to get monopoly power so that they could put prices up, exploit the consumer, exploit suppliers. And we see that in many cases. When firms have monopoly power, they don't act in the interest of the greater good. And many firms are very profitable. And at the moment, companies like Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft have huge cash reserves that they make profit from their monopoly power, but they're not using this for the greater good. They're keeping a lot of it in tax havens in Bermuda, the Bahamas, or wherever. Also, another critique of capitalism is the whole idea that the goal of life is to increase output. Because in the capitalist model, it tends to create this dynamic of ever increasing output. But does that bring happiness? And a new branch of economics, which has come around in the past few decades, is placing more emphasis on what brings happiness. And that might be things such as maximizing leisure time, making sure people have a worthwhile job, people have a career that they feel attached to. And one of the early critiques of capitalism was Karl Marx. And although his solutions had many, many problems, one thing he observed is how alienated workers could be. In the early assembly lines and factories, it was very boring work. So capitalism tends to create winners and losers. Those who own capital can do very, very well, but those who are working for poor conditions and with limited power to bargain for higher wages, they tend to lose out. So capitalism has tended to evolve. And if you look at many of the so-called capitalist economies in Western Europe, actually they've become much less so. The government can intervene in many aspects of the economy, especially with healthcare, education, the welfare state. And the aim of this is to kind of combine the benefits of capitalism and free markets with avoiding its worst excesses. So we're not aiming for equality of outcome, but equality of opportunity. Also, one final point is that since the 1980s, China's economy has become more and more capitalist, more and more free market, but this hasn't led to any increase in political freedom. So that's just to kind of counter Milton Friedman's hope or aspiration that economic freedom leads to political freedom. So capitalism, to some extent, is always going to be with us in some form, but with great inequality and real problems facing the environment, we're going to need to really amend and make sure that we don't just think of people's self-interest, but also the interest of future generations and creating the best of both worlds.